anybody. This is the Liberty Agenda, and we're going to have the last video of the pre-revolutionary period. The last time we left off, there had been a kind of a lull here after the Gaspee incident, and then the Gaspee incident was where the boat went ashore, and the Patriots attacked the boat and burned it and shot the captain and created some uproar, but it also, I think, reignited some of the patriotic fervor or some of the discontent that had been sort of festering for a while. But I think there had been about a couple of years period after the Boston Massacre that most people wanted to quiet down after having a lot of issues with the Townsend Act and the Stamp Act and so many, sort of rebellion and resistance activities and political activities. So finally we get to this point where we're going to have the Boston Tea Party, and we're going to talk about sort of what led to that. I'll go over here. Okay. So it's kind of ironic that we would have in our national memory the Boston Tea Party is sort of the opening event of the Revolutionary War. It really wasn't in some ways, or at least it shouldn't have been, although it did really light the fuse, but for reasons that you wouldn't think. In effect, the tea that was shipped into Boston from the East India Company was less expensive than the tea they were getting through the smuggling trade from the Dutch. And so you'd wonder, why would the revolution be triggered by something as simple as importing tea that was actually less expensive than what they had already been paying? On top of this, the people that were resisting this or that were not happy about this were the smugglers, the people that were getting the tea, duty-free from the Dutch. But even though the tea coming in from Britain had duties applied to it through the process of the arrangements that the British had made with the East India Company, the actual price to the colonies was less. Part of the fear that they had was that that the East India Company would have started selling products directly to the population, sort of bypassing the merchants, and the tea was sort of just the opening salvo of this. And so the merchant class, as opposed to the plantation owners and the laborers and the average person, the merchant class were the ones that really were upset about the tea coming in from the East India Company. So the British had repealed the duties or the colonial duty on East India tea. The tea was coming in, it previously would come in through England. There would be certain fees or whatever, and then it would be shipped out from England. Now they were going to ship tea directly from India. And along with tea, you might have other products as well later on. And so this was threatening sort of the economic welfare of a certain class of people there. When the tea came in, it was coming into all the major ports. Tea was a huge consumable in the colonies. Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, of course, were the major ports, seaports. And, really you would think that you could have had a rebellion or a sort of Tea Party event in any of these other cities. The situation in Boston, however, was that Boston was looked at as the hotbed of resistance and any potential revolutionary movement. So the focus of attention in enforcing the trade laws and just a lot of things, there was a lot of suspicion on Boston and Massachusetts in general, but Boston in particular. So when the tea came in, they really couldn't get to the people at fault. I mean, who would they riot against, or who would the mob go after? There wasn't really an easy way to get at or to show their resentment, these merchants. So all they could do was board the ship and throw the tea in the harbor, and that's what they did. And so, even though it was not really an obvious ploy or economic hardship in any way, and in some respects, people, this was a trigger to the idea that the British were going to start maneuvering things in such a way that they could enforce the kind of dependency and the kind of trade on the colonies that they wanted. And this kind of control aspect of it, I think, was a big part of the resistance against it. So when the December 16th, 1773, about 3 years, maybe 2.5 years before the Declaration of Independence, when they did this act, there was violence attached to it. They went after some of the people that were enforcing the trade laws, whatever you call it, the places where the trade, the money, the treasury, and that kind of thing. Some of the money was actually kept in the governors or in one of the high-level people in the government. So they would go against these people and sort of, terrorize them in some way. And this got back to Britain, and Britain just felt this was sort of an outrage. There was really no excuse for it. And so Britain wanted to make really a radical move to sort of say, this is enough. We're going to push this thing right now to the point where it's going to be us, you or us. One or the other was going to have to come out on top. So the Boston Port Bill, this was in March of 1774. So they enacted this, which would close the Boston port. This would be obviously a destructive, economically destructive to Boston and to the rest of Massachusetts and that region. And this was really sort of an act of economic war. If it wasn't an act of real war, it was considered a drastic and sort of tyrannical step. One could have argued on the part of the colonists, well, these people that we don't really know who they were, they dressed up like Indians, they got on board the ship, they threw the tea over. A lot of us don't really have anything to do with this. Why would you basically destroy our economic activity here by closing the port? So, both sides of that coin were kind of there. You had sort of like a bad marriage or relationship between two people where there was resentment and sort of reasons on both sides for the kind of anger and the feelings that people had. So this closing of the port in Boston was seen by all the colonies as a sort of justification for this rebellion that had always been festering in Boston. The whole revolutionary movement originated and sort of spawned out of Boston. And so this really was a way of uniting the colonies once again, and was really the beginning of what would transpire afterwards that would lead up to Lexington and Concord. So once again, a general boycott was called, and that meant the colonies were not going to trade with Britain at all. They weren't going to export or import. I don't really know, what that meant exactly. I guess they just weren't going to accept tea at all at that point from the East India Company or anybody else. And so there was a big push to just not drink tea. It was patriotic to drink coffee at that point. And I think as one can argue that the idea that we don't drink tea here originates with this period where drinking tea was considered subverting the revolutionary movement, and so people just tried to get off of it and drink something else for their caffeine. So this unity in the colonies for this Tea Party act that really again raised a lot of concern. You had the Boston Port Act, this sort of direct economic attack, radical act against Boston. And so you had the country uniting and actually sending a lot of relief support to the people in Boston. And so this became apparent that they could hold out for a long time in Boston. People from around the country were going to support them. And I think it was pretty clear at this point to the British that this was an irreconcilable problem, that whatever the issues were, there just wasn't going to be anything that they could do short of basically just granting them full independence in some way. There just didn't seem to be anything they could do to deal with the revenue problem, to deal with trying to have any form of taxation or enforcement of their own mercantilism strategy. And so there was pretty much a recognition that they were not going to be able to solve the problem. So at this point, you had really three things the British did. You had the Boston Port Bill, which I mentioned. You had the Quebec Act. So in Quebec, that province was going to be expanded. The boundaries would be expanded south quite a long ways, south of the Ohio River. And so the colonists recognized this as a way of sort of boxing them in and preventing them from expanding in that direction. And it was also going to kind of create a strategic problem for them. And so I think the coercive act, and then the last item was they were announced that they were going to revise or recreate a new Massachusetts constitution. And so the British government was going to come in sort of an arbitrary, autocratic way and say, we are going to force you to revise your constitution in Massachusetts. Well, this was, now you had a radical political act on top of, a radical sort of geographic change with the Quebec Act, and then you had the Boston Port Bill. So it was sort of inevitable, and you can see why this really pushed people to the point where this was just not going to stand. So in Massachusetts at this point, the areas outside of Boston were British authority was pretty much wiped out. People started gearing up. They started, collecting, arms, practicing shooting, getting powder and cartridges for their muskets, this kind of thing. They did this partly because there was actually one of their strategies was they wanted to have a defensive position. They knew that Britain would find out about this, and they felt that this would sort of cow Britain into backing off. But I think most people recognized that probably wasn't going to work. But this was sort of the idea. I don't think anybody felt that really they could sustain any kind of a direct military conflict with the British. And yet this was what was starting to happen. So you could see the pressure kind of building up, and the opportunity, or at least the likelihood that there could be some kind of violence, was starting to increase. At the same time, I think that the idea that you could have violence, you could have mob violence, you could have skirmishes and military, sort of violent interactions, even though it wouldn't be a full engagement of war. A lot of people, the oligarchs, the leaders in the political environment, the government, the Privy Council, the governor, these kinds of people, the Tories, the people that were loyalists, they all fled into Boston because that's where whatever military protection there was, that was where it would be. So you saw this sort of consolidation of the loyalists into the city, and then the outside of the city was considered sort of out of control at that point. There wasn't really any respect for British authority, and so you saw this divide sort of almost immediately break out at that point. So let's see if I can go back here. So you had the Boston Port Bill in March of 1774, and then in September of 1774, you had these other events happening in the meantime between March and September. And then you had the Continental Congress, sort of the first part of the Continental Congress. They called it the First Continental Congress and the Second Continental Congress, but they were kind of the same thing, except there was a break in between the first. So the first one was an effort to figure out if they could avoid war, if they could find some way to, some conciliatory measure or some way to avoid further conflict or some inevitable, break that would cause something even worse. And when they had this first meeting, there was a lot of division among the different factions, the different parties that were at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Adams made the comment that 1/3 were Tories, 1/3 were Whigs, and 1/3 were mongrels. And I think the Whigs were not patriots, but they were more sympathetic towards the sort of classic desire for freedom, for individual liberty. The Tories were more of the autocrats, more of the establishment, if you want to call it that. And the mongrels would be considered people that just didn't have a position. They were would shift with the winds. So there wasn't really a lot of, at this first meeting, there wasn't really a lot of hope that you were going to have any kind of strong resolution to some kind of independence movement or something like this, which the Patriots wanted. The Patriots were the activists, the radicals, so to speak, quote unquote, but there wasn't really they didn't have a majority, and they were going to have to be kind of quiet and not push their agenda, especially the ones out of Boston. Boston, again, was the hotbed of a lot of this stuff. But in the first Congress here, you actually had radicals from the South who were voicing, more aggressive kind of responses. And so the Bostonians, Adams and anyone that was coming from Massachusetts were kind of backing off and letting the facts speak for themselves and so on. There was an idea they would draft up a letter for some kind of a grand council. I don't know, sort of a quasi parliament for the colonies, and this grand council would somehow provide some representation to the British government. But this whole idea really wasn't going to fly. The British weren't going to accept it, and by the time it actually was seen and reviewed and so on, it became a dead letter. It wasn't really going to have any effect, and events kind of overtook them anyway. In the meantime, Paul Revere, came down. There had been a resolution in Suffolk County in Massachusetts that they wanted to have defensive military preparations, as I mentioned before. And on October 8th, the Continental Congress approved that. It's interesting that a lot of the goings on, of course you had the Tories in there, and you had people that, it was easy for the information and the proceedings of the Congress to get out, so a lot of this stuff would leak out. But I think they knew that, and so some of these things may not have been done immediately. So you see the October 8th was not at the beginning, was kind of towards the end of this first gathering. And by the time Britain found out that you had this defensive military preparations, it wasn't really. It was kind of a moot point probably by that point. On December 1st, again, in between the Continental Congress sessions, there was a mandate. Really, this was sort of a preliminary to a declaration in a sense, because they were saying, everybody must conform to this non-import export boycott. And so you had this response was mainly, so here you had military preparations in effect, at least in Massachusetts, and then you had this sort of mandated, saying that we as a body, as a united colonies, are going to insist that we're going to boycott, and we're going to wage economic warfare, at least against the mother country. The Tories, of course, opposed all of this, and this was where the split was. So by the winter of 1774, a lot of these things were going on. You had, the September Congress was trying to avoid war. There hadn't really been any kind of declaration at that point. And, these people still remembered the Boston Massacre. There was a lot of resentment about just the British presence, the army being, there. They didn't have, people still had refused to provide quartering so that they had housing. The soldiers were miserable, unhappy, resentful, just like it was a two-way street. The people resented the military, and the military kind of resented the people. And then you had these, I think some of these, they probably resorted to drinking. There was a certain amount of this kind of rabble rousing, maybe even criminal activity. Some of it might have been exaggerated, but you may have had some things being initiated, some kind of criminal activity that the soldiers were actually perpetrating. And of course, this was used as a way to even arouse people, their frustration and anger more. Also, the British, probably the Tories, as well as the people in Britain, were taunting the military themselves, saying, "Why aren't you doing something? Why aren't you fixing this problem?" And of course, it was not that simple. Like so many things, the people that are not directly involved don't understand that you can't just go out and start rounding people up and putting them in jail for no reason. You're going. I think they recognized that they were dealing with people that were possibly armed, and you still had some semblance of civil law at that point. So, what could you do? What could the army actually do to make this problem go away? You had people spread all over the countryside. You couldn't really tell the good guys from the bad guys. It would not have been easy or even possible for the military to sort of put this resistance down. So the military were feeling definitely put upon. No one liked them. The people in the colonies didn't like them. Their own people didn't like them, or resented or taunted them, and so they were in a bad position as well. And then you had, these, again, they were trying to enforce, or at least prevent sort of a military buildup in some way. They would go out into the countryside when they got word, and you definitely had people on both sides sort of reporting things. So if people were collecting, powder, or they were collecting, muskets or other kinds of arms, the Tories that lived in that area would report them. Then the army would send somebody out to try and collect this stuff. You would end up with skirmishes, kind of back and forth on this. So, this tensions were certainly building up. Then there was a report that there was a large powder magazine. This is a location where they were storing powder in Lexington. And as I, probably went over in the second episode of this series, this was the trigger point, because they were going to go out and take this large powder magazine in Lexington Concord, because they were continuing to try and keep them from arming themselves up to an extreme degree. And so at this time also there was an arrest warrant put out for Sam Adams and John Hancock. I don't think those were ever fulfilled. If they had been able to arrest them, they may have taken them back to England and tried them for treason. So you can see the escalation here, and it just seems hard to believe that starting out with something just like tea, not wanting to take the tea, you can see how it wasn't that simple. There were all of these things leading up to it, until finally you had this rather deadly conflict that happened in Lexington. When they went in, the people had gathered around, they tried to get to this powder magazine, and at the North Bridge you had the shot that was heard around the world, where the actual first real serious confrontation took place between the British and the colonials. That's about it for this one. At some point I will go through the Revolutionary War, the actual war itself. That's a long kind of period of time where there's lots of different activities going on, and strategies, and push and pull, and It was really an agonizing, difficult kind of conflict. Mostly, the American, the Continental Army under Washington was trying to avoid direct conflict. So it was kind of what they call a Fabian conflict, or basically a defensive war. And yet, they wanted to try to bring it to a resolution. You also had the war sort of migrating. It was in Boston. You had the siege of Boston, where the original conflict took place in the city, in Bunker Hill. And then you had the siege, where they basically, closed down the city, and eventually the British withdrew from Boston itself, and they went to New York. And so mostly the center of the British power during the Revolutionary War was in New York City. There were large encampments in Staten Island, and then you had other things on the island of Manhattan and in Long Island as well. But that's really where the war went after Boston, and that's where where the conflict was occurring when the Declaration actually was announced. And ironically enough, New York was anything but a success for General Washington at that point. And I'm sure that the outlook through much of the Revolutionary War was pretty dim. And I don't think that up until the last minute, it was Yorktown, which was in the Chesapeake Bay, several years later. There were, most of the time, it was probably not deemed as a likely prospect that they could win, and yet eventually they did. So there's a whole bunch of things that can be talked about regarding the war itself, which is very interesting in its own light, but something that will have to be addressed separately. So that's it for now.